Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We often look at history through the lens of great battles, gleaming castles, and famous kings. We tell stories of glory and conquest. But there is another side to history, a shadow side. It is found in the quiet, terrified whispers of small villages, in the muddy backroads of the past, and in the desperate rituals of people trying to survive in a world they didn't fully understand. Today, we are going to explore a profession that sounds like it belongs in a dark fantasy novel, but was, for centuries, a very real and gritty part of life in England, Wales, and parts of Europe. We are talking about the Sin Eater. Imagine a job where your only duty is to consume the damnation of another human being. A job where you are essential to the community's spiritual survival, yet you are treated with more disgust than a leper. It is a story of poverty, superstition, and the terrifying lengths humans will go to for peace of mind. Before we step into the darkness, if you enjoy uncovering the strange, the macabre, and the forgotten corners of history, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps these stories reach more people. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a journey into the past. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's travel back to the 17th century, to a time when a piece of bread could save a soul, and a single meal could damn a man forever. To understand the Sin Eater, we must first set the scene. Imagine it is the year 1680. You are standing in a small, isolated cottage in the deep valleys of the Welsh marches. Outside, the rain is relentless, turning the world into gray mud. But inside, the atmosphere is suffocating. The air smells of sickness, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of death that no amount of burning herbs can fully mask. In the center of the room, lying on a rough wooden table, is a corpse. It is the body of a man who died just hours ago. He is shrouded in white linen, his face exposed, pale and waxy in the flickering candlelight. Around him, his family stands pressed against the walls. They are weeping, yes, but if you look closely at their faces, you see something stronger than grief. You see terror. This man did not die well. Perhaps he died in a sudden fit of rage, or with a secret greed in his heart. Maybe he died in an accident before the priest could arrive. In this world, dying without confessing your sins is a catastrophe. It means his soul is heavy, weighed down by a lifetime of moral failings. The family believes that this weight will drag him down, trapping him as a restless ghost that will haunt their home, or worse, plunging him into the eternal fires of hell. They cannot let that happen. The priest can do nothing for him now. He is beyond the reach of the church's standard prayers. They need a different kind of intervention. They need a transaction. The heavy oak door creaks open. A gust of cold wind blows the candles, making the shadows dance wildly on the walls. A figure steps across the threshold. He is a man who looks like he belongs to the mud outside more than the warmth inside. He is ragged, filthy, his clothes stained and torn. He keeps his eyes downcast, staring at the dirt floor. He does not greet the widow. He does not offer condolences. He knows his place. He is the Sin Eater. He approaches the table where the dead man lies. The widow steps forward, her hands trembling. On a wooden platter, she holds a loaf of bread and a bowl of ale. With a shuddering breath, she places the loaf of bread directly onto the corpse's chest, right over the silent heart. In some traditions, she might place it directly over the dead man's mouth. The room holds its breath. This is the crucial moment. The belief here is visceral and terrifyingly literal. They believe that as the soul leaves the body, the sins are exhaled with it. By placing the bread on the body, the bread acts as a spiritual sponge. It absorbs the lust, the violence, the envy, and the greed of the deceased. The bread becomes toxic with sin. The sin eater reaches out with a grimy hand. He picks up the bread from the dead man's chest. He lifts the bowl of ale. And then, as the family watches with a mixture of intense relief and utter revulsion, he eats. He swallows the bread, mouthful by dry mouthful. He washes it down with the ale. He pauses, swallowing hard, as if the food itself is jagged. In the eyes of the family, the ritual is complete. He has literally eaten the damnation of the deceased. The dead man's soul is now light, clean, free to ascend to heaven. But the sin eater? He has just added another lifetime of spiritual filth to his own soul. He turns to leave. The widow presses a single coin, a sixpence, into his hand. He walks back out into the night, carrying the weight of a stranger's hell in his stomach. Behind him, the family immediately smashes the bowl he drank from, terrified of catching the contagion he carries. This ritual defies our modern logic. We live in a world of science, of psychology, of cause and effect. But to understand the sin eater, we have to strip all of that away. We have to enter the mind of a medieval villager. In their world, the barrier between the physical and the spiritual was paper thin. A sin wasn't just a bad thought or a wrong action. It was a physical substance. It was like a virus or a poison. And because it was a substance, it could be moved. It could be transferred from one vessel to another. This idea is ancient. It goes back to the biblical concept of the scapegoat, where a priest would whisper the sins of the community into the ear of a goat and drive it into the wilderness. The goat hadn't done anything wrong, but it carried the burden away. The sin eater was simply a human scapegoat. But instead of being driven into the desert, he was summoned to the dinner table. But why was this necessary? Why were people so terrified? The answer lies in the medieval geography of the afterlife. We tend to think of it as a binary choice, heaven or hell. But for the people of the Middle Ages, there was a third option, and it was the one that kept them awake at night. Purgatory. Purgatory was the great waiting room of the afterlife. It was a place of fire and suffering, designed to burn away minor sins before a soul could enter heaven. If you were a saint, you went to heaven. If you were a monster, you went to hell. But for everyone else, for the vast majority of humanity, purgatory was the destination. The length of your stay depended on your sin debt. It could be 10 years. It could be 1,000. The thought of a loved one burning in agony for centuries was unbearable. The Church offered ways to shorten this time: masses, prayers, alms. But these were preventative measures or long-term solutions. They didn't help with the immediate crisis of a bad death. A sudden death meant the soul was caught unprepared, fully loaded with sin. The sin eater was the emergency brake. He was the only one who could intervene at the very moment of death to strip those sins away instantly. The ritual itself varied across regions. In the rugged hills of Wales, it was solemn and dark. In parts of England, it might have been slightly more casual, but the core element remained the same: the consumption of food that had been in contact with the dead. The bread represented the body, the earth, the physical vessel. The drink, usually ale, sometimes milk or wine, acted as the solvent, the washing down of the spirit. But consider the man who performed this service. Who would agree to such a thing? Who would willingly turn their own body into a garbage disposal for the spiritual waste of a village? You might imagine a holy man, a monk, or a shaman, someone with the spiritual strength to battle these demons. But that would be a mistake. The sin-eater was almost always the lowest of the low. These were the outcasts, the starving, the destitute. Often they were men who had fallen out of favor with society, criminals who had served their time but were never welcomed back, alcoholics, or the mentally ill. They were people who were already living on the fringe, people for whom the salvation of their own soul was a luxury they couldn't afford. They traded their eternal future for a meal today. The economics of the job were brutal. A sixpence was a pittance. It was enough to buy a few loaves of bread or a few drinks at the tavern. It wasn't enough to change a life. It wasn't enough to buy a farm or start a trade. It was just enough to survive for another few days. For this small coin, the sin-eater agreed to be damned. He agreed to take on the sins of a stranger, the violence of a brawler, the greed of a miser, the lust of an adulterer. He took it all into himself. And the cost wasn't just spiritual. It was intensely social. By becoming a sin-eater, a man accepted a status that was in some ways lower than a leper. A leper was sick. A sin-eater was voluntarily unclean. He was taboo. The villagers needed him. They couldn't bury their dead in peace without him, but they were terrified of him. He lived in isolation, often in a shack on the edge of the woods or in a cave outside the village boundaries. When he walked into town, the mood would shift. Mothers would pull their children close and turn their faces away. Men would cross the street to avoid walking in his shadow. Shopkeepers might leave food out for him, but would refuse to take the coins from his hand, fearing that the money itself was tainted by the sins he carried. He was a living ghost, haunting the edges of the community he served. There is a tragic irony here. The sin-eater performed the most selfless act imaginable. He sacrificed his own soul to save another. In a Christian context, this is almost a Christ-like figure, someone taking on the sins of the world. Yet the church despised them, and the people feared them. He was a savior who was treated like a monster. In the next part of this series, we are going to dive deeper into the lives of these men. We will look at the specific historical accounts that have survived, records from the 18th and 19th centuries that give us names and faces to put to this shadowy profession. We will explore the last sin-eater of England, a man whose story is both heartbreaking and fascinating. And we will ask the question, what happened to the sins he ate? Did people really believe he could carry them forever? Or was there a breaking point? We have witnessed the ritual on the chest of the dead. We have understood the fear that drove it. Now we must walk the lonely road with the man who carries the burden. The bread has been eaten. The coin has been paid. But for the sin-eater, the night is far from over. Join me in part 2 as we uncover the human cost of eating sins. The door to the cottage slams shut, barring the rain and the darkness, but also barring the man who just saved them. Inside, the family can now breathe. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of doom has lifted. They can mourn their father now as a man who has gone to a better place, his slate wiped clean. They turn to each other with relief, perhaps pouring a fresh round of ale, the tension leaving their shoulders. But outside, in the mud and the cold, the transaction is far from over. The sin-eater walks away from the village. In his hand, he clutches the silver sixpence. It is a small, cold circle of metal, the only tangible reward for the service he has just performed. But in his stomach, the bread sits heavy. It is a phantom weight. To a modern mind, it is just dough and yeast, digesting like any other meal. But to him, and to everyone who knows what he is, that bread is a spiritual poison. He can feel it. He believes with every fiber of his being that he is now carrying the dead man's rage, his greed, his unconfessed adulteries. They are swirling inside him, mixing with the sins of the last man he ate for, and the woman before that. He is becoming a vessel of compounded damnation. He does not head to the tavern to spend his coin. He cannot. He heads to the outskirts, to the fringes where the woods meet the untamed wild. This is where the sin-eater lives, not in the heart of the community, but on its edge. This geography is not accidental. It is symbolic. He is the border guard between the living and the dead, and therefore, he belongs to neither world. As we delve deeper into the life of the sin-eater, we confront a profound paradox. He was essential. In the remote valleys of Wales, the rugged hills of Shropshire, and the isolated hamlets of the Scottish borders, the sin-eater was a critical component of the social machinery. Without him, the machinery of death broke down. Without him, ghosts would wander. Without him, families would live in perpetual terror of haunting. In a very real sense, he provided a service more valuable than the doctor or the lawyer. The doctor could only delay death. The lawyer could only argue over earthly possessions. The sin-eater secured eternity. And yet, he was revulsed. He was treated with a mixture of fear, disgust, and superstitious hatred that is hard to articulate in modern terms. Think of him as a spiritual sewage worker. We all need sewage systems to keep our cities clean, to take away the filth so we don't die of disease. But we don't want to swim in the sewage, and we certainly don't want to invite the sewage worker to dinner while he is covered in the filth of his trade. The sin-eater was the sewage worker for the human soul. He took the spiritual waste that no one else could handle, and he took it into his own body. This created a unique and terrible social status. He was taboo. In anthropological terms, a taboo figure is someone who is both sacred and unclean. He has power, but it is a dirty power. When the sin-eater walked into a village during the day, which was rare, the reaction was visceral. People would physically recoil. If his shadow fell across a person, that person might rush home to wash themselves or say a prayer. It was believed that the sins he carried were contagious, like a spiritual leprosy. If you looked him in the eye, you might invite the evil eye, or you might accidentally draw some of those restless spirits into yourself. So he lived a life of utter silence. No one spoke to him unless someone had died. No one invited him to weddings, to baptisms, to harvest festivals. He was excluded from the cycle of life, summoned only for the finality of death. Imagine a life where your only human contact occurs when someone is weeping, terrified, or handing you a dead man's meal. Imagine a life where no one ever smiles at you, where children are taught to run from you, where your name is used as a threat to frighten naughty toddlers. Be good, or the sin-eater will come for you. But who were these men? Who accepts such a cursed existence? The historical record is sparse, precisely because these were people society wanted to forget. But the fragments we have paint a portrait of desperate necessity. They were rarely people who chose this path out of a desire to do good. They were the debris of a harsh and unforgiving world. Many were the extreme poor. We are talking about a level of poverty that is difficult to visualize today. The kind of poverty where starvation is a weekly possibility. For a man with no land, no trade, and no family support, the promise of a free meal, even a meal eaten off a corpse, was a powerful motivator. The bread, the ale, and the sixpence might be the only thing keeping him alive for another week. In this light, sin-eating was a survival strategy. It was a macabre form of gig economy for the destitute. Others were the mentally ill or the physically disabled. In a time before asylums or social care, those who were touched in the head or born with deformities were often pushed to the margins. They were already seen as strange, perhaps already suspected of being connected to the devil or bad luck. Becoming a sin-eater was just a formalization of their outcast status. It gave them a defined role in a society that otherwise had no use for them. And then there were the soldiers. Veterans returning from the brutal wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, the English Civil War, the various conflicts on the continent. Men who came back broken, perhaps suffering from what we would now call PTSD, unable to reintegrate into peaceful village life. They had seen death close up. They were already comfortable with it. They were already scarred. Perhaps they felt they were already damned for the things they had done in battle, so eating a few more sins wouldn't make much difference. But regardless of how they found the job, once they took the first crust of bread, there was no going back. You didn't dabble in sin-eating. Once you were known as the sin-eater, the label stuck. It was a life sentence. You were marked. Even if you wanted to stop, the village wouldn't let you. Who else would save them? If a former sin-eater tried to get a normal job, say as a farmhand, who would hire him? Who would want the man full of ghosts working in their fields, potentially blighting the crops? The trap was absolute. Let's look at the mechanics of his daily survival. How did he buy food with his tainted money? This reveals the depth of the superstition. When a sin-eater went to a market stall to buy a sack of flour or some vegetables, he wouldn't hand the coin to the merchant. He would place the sixpence in a bowl of water or vinegar provided by the trader. The coin had to be washed, cleansed of the spiritual residue of his hand before a decent Christian would touch it. He would take his goods and leave without a word. It was a transaction between species, not between neighbors. And what of his own mind? This is the most haunting question. Did the sin-eater believe in the ritual? The answer, almost certainly, is yes. He was a product of the same society, the same belief system as the people who hired him. He feared hell just as much as they did. He knew, or thought he knew, that he was consuming damnation. Imagine the psychological toll. Every time he ate the bread, he believed he was eroding his own chance at salvation. He was sacrificing his eternal soul, piece by piece, for the sake of his neighbors. He was a martyr who was hated by the people he was saving. He walked around believing he was a living vessel of evil. The weight of that guilt, not his own guilt, but the accumulated guilt of 100 strangers, must have been crushing. It is no surprise that many accounts suggest sin-eaters were heavy drinkers. The bowl of ale provided at the funeral was just the start. Alcohol was the only way to numb the voices, to quiet the fear of what awaited him when his own time came. Because that was the ultimate terror for the sin-eater, his own death. When a sin-eater died, who would eat his sins? He was full to the brim with the wickedness of the entire valley. He carried the lies of the merchant, the cruelty of the landlord, the thefts of the peasant. Who could possibly consume a burden that heavy? The answer was no one. The sin-eater died knowing, with absolute certainty, that he was going straight to the deepest pit of hell. There would be no bread on his chest, no one to save him. He was the dam, holding back the floodwater, and when the dam broke, he would be swept away. This tragic figure lingered in the shadows of the British Isles far longer than you might expect. This wasn't just a medieval curiosity that vanished with the Renaissance. It survived the Enlightenment. It survived the Industrial Revolution. While factories were being built in London and steam trains were beginning to cross the country, in the quiet, dark hills of Shropshire and Wales, men were still eating bread off corpses. We have records of sin-eaters operating well into the 19th century. They became a kind of dark secret of the rural communities. As the cities modernized and education spread, the practice began to be looked down upon as savage or backward. The villagers knew that the outside world, the educated world, the church authorities, would mock them or condemn them. So the ritual went underground. It was performed at night, in secret, with a lookout posted to watch for the priest. And that brings us to the great enemy of the sin-eater. You might think the church would support a practice that dealt with sin and the afterlife. But the official church, both Catholic and later Protestant, hated the sin-eater. To the priest, the sin-eater was a competitor. He was a usurper. He was performing a sacrament without a license. He was offering salvation for a sixpence, undercutting the authority of the church to forgive sins. More importantly, the sin-eater represented a theology that the church was trying to stamp out, a blend of pagan folklore and Christian fear that they couldn't control. The priest offered forgiveness through prayer, repentance, and the grace of God. The sin-eater offered forgiveness through magic and digestion. It was a battle for the souls of the people, and for a long time, the church was losing. Because when a man is dead on the table and the family is terrified, they don't want abstract theological comfort. They want the man in the corner who can make the problem go away for a coin. In the next part of our journey, we will explore this conflict. We will see how the church tried to hunt down these men, to brand them as heretics and witches. We will look at the specific legends that sprang up. Stories of sin-eaters who supposedly went mad from the sins they carried, or who were said to be able to see the ghosts of the people they had eaten. The bread has been digested. The coin has been spent. The sin-eater is alone in his shack, listening to the wind, knowing that the next knock on the door means another death. But the world outside is changing. The gas lights are coming on in the cities, and the shadows where he hides are shrinking. The end of his kind is approaching, but it will not be a quiet end. Join me in part 3 as we witness the war between the priest and the pariah. The church bell rings out across the valley. It is a sound of authority, of order, of God's dominion over the chaotic lives of the peasantry. To the villagers working in the fields, it is a call to prayer, a reminder of the time of day. But to the sin-eater, huddling in his shack on the edge of the woods, that bell is the sound of his enemy. For centuries, a silent war was waged in the shadows of the British Isles. It was not a war fought with armies or cannons, but with sermons, threats, and the terror of excommunication. It was the war between the priest and the pariah. To understand why this conflict became so bitter and why it eventually drove the sin-eater underground, we must look at the world through the eyes of the church. To a parish priest in the 18th or 19th century, the sin-eater was not just a nuisance. He was a blasphemy. He was a walking insult to the very foundations of Christianity. The church taught that forgiveness was the exclusive province of God, mediated through his ordained clergy. You sinned, you confessed, you did penance, and you were absolved. It was a vertical transaction between earth and heaven. The sin-eater, however, offered a horizontal transaction. He offered a shortcut. He bypassed the priest, bypassed the penance, and bypassed God entirely. He sold salvation for a sixpence and a loaf of bread. To the clergy, this was idolatry. It was witchcraft. It was the belief that a dirty mortal man could perform the miracle of Christ, taking away the sins of the world, simply by eating a sandwich. It was a mockery of the Holy Communion. In the Eucharist, the faithful eat bread to receive life. In the sin-eater's ritual, he ate bread to consume death. The church authorities called it damnable superstition. They preached against it from the pulpits with fire and brimstone. Vicars would stand before their congregations and thunder that anyone who hired a sin-eater was endangering their own soul as much as the deceased. They threatened to refuse burial in consecrated ground for anyone known to have used the services of the bread-eater. Imagine the terror this caused for the grieving families. They were caught in a brutal pincer movement. On one side, they had the ancient, visceral fear of the angry ghost, the belief that if they didn't hire the sin-eater, their father's spirit would torment the farm forever. On the other side, they had the fear of the church, the threat that if they did hire him, the priest would damn them all and refuse a Christian burial. It was a choice between haunting in this life or hellfire in the next. And more often than not, the people chose to deal with the immediate threat. They feared the ghost in the living room more than the priest in the pulpit. But they had to be careful. The ritual, which had once been performed relatively openly in the presence of the whole family, began to retreat into the shadows. It became a midnight affair, a clandestine operation. When a death occurred, a messenger would be sent running to the woods under the cover of darkness. The sin-eater would arrive not through the front door, but through the back, or he would be smuggled into the stable where the body had been laid out in secret. The family would keep watch at the window, terrified that the vicar might see the candlelight or the silhouette of the ragged man. The ritual became hurried, stripped of its solemnity. The bread was eaten quickly, eyes darting to the door. The coin was pressed into a dirty hand, and the sin-eater was shoved back out into the night before the sun rose. He became a secret shame, a dirty family secret that everyone shared, but no one spoke of. But the pressure wasn't just external. Inside the mind of the sin-eater, a different kind of war was raging. We must ask ourselves, what happens to a human mind that believes, truly believes, it is a container for the evil of 1,000 souls? The folklore is full of stories about the madness of the sin-eaters. It was said that they couldn't sleep. How could you sleep when the murderers, the thieves, and the abusers you had eaten were screaming in your head? Legends say that sin-eaters would wander the hills at night, talking to themselves, arguing with invisible adversaries. They were seen thrashing at the air, trying to beat away the ghosts that clung to them. One particularly chilling legend from Shropshire tells of a sin-eater who tried to enter a church. He didn't want to disrupt the service. Perhaps he just wanted to feel the warmth, or hear the music, or remember what it felt like to be human. But as he stepped across the threshold, it is said that the candles on the altar flickered and died. The congregation turned, and upon seeing him, they screamed. They didn't see a man. They saw a monster, his face twisted by the weight of the sins he carried. The priest drove him out with a crucifix, not as a man, but as a demon. He fled back to the woods, weeping, because he realized that the house of God was closed to him forever. There were physical tolls, too. The job was grotesque. In times of plague or smallpox, the sin-eater was expected to eat bread off the chests of highly infectious corpses. He was the only one who would go near the body, when even the family kept their distance. Many sin-eaters died not from the spiritual weight, but from the very literal contagion of their trade. They contracted the diseases of the dead, and when a sin-eater fell sick, who would nurse him? No one. He lay in his shack, feverish and alone, dying on the dirt floor while the village waited for him to expire so they could find a new scapegoat. And yet, despite the persecution of the church and the physical danger, the profession persisted. Why? Because the psychological need for closure is one of the strongest human drives. The Sin Eater offered something the church often denied: certainty. When the priest prayed for a soul, he said maybe. He said, God willing. He offered hope, but no guarantees. The soul might be in purgatory for a week or a century. The Sin Eater offered a guarantee. The bread is gone. The sin is gone. It is finished. For a grieving mother, terrified for her son's soul, that certainty was worth defying the Pope himself. It was worth the sixpence. It was worth the risk. But as the 19th century rolled on, a new enemy appeared, one far more dangerous to the Sin Eater than the priest: the Enlightenment, science, the industrial age. The world was getting brighter. Gas lamps were banishing the shadows from the streets. Education was spreading to the rural poor. The younger generation was learning about germs, about medicine, about logic. They began to look at their parents' superstitions with embarrassment. The Sin Eater, once a terrifying necessity, was beginning to look like a foolish relic of a dark past. The villagers started to feel shame, not just fear. They were ashamed that they still needed this magic. They were ashamed of the ragged man in the woods. He became a symbol of their own backwardness. And so, the hostility shifted. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was contempt. Boys would throw stones at the Sin Eater, not because they feared his evil eye, but because he was a crazy old fool. The pool of men willing to take the job began to shrink. The desperate poor had other options now: the workhouse, the factory, the city. Why stay in a mud-soaked valley and eat sins for a sixpence when you could move to Birmingham or Manchester and work in a mill? The supply of Sin Eaters dried up, leaving only the oldest, the most stubborn, or the most traditional families continuing the practice. We see this transition in the historical records. By the mid-1800s, the accounts of sin-eating are often written by curious folklorists from the cities. Men from Oxford or London traveling to the wilds of Wales to observe the quaint savages. They describe the Sin Eater not as a terrifying figure of power, but as a pitiful, dying breed. They describe old men, toothless and senile, performing the ritual by rote memory, while the younger generation watched with skepticism. But there is a specific darkness in these twilight years. Imagine being the last Sin Eater in your valley. You are old. You have spent 40 years eating the sins of your neighbors. You have watched the world change around you. The priest still hates you, but now the school teacher laughs at you too. You are completely alone. And you know that when you die, the tradition dies with you. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps real, of a Sin Eater in the late 19th century who was summoned to the bedside of a dying man who had been a great sinner, a cruel landlord who had starved his tenants. The family prepared the bread and the ale, but when the Sin Eater arrived and looked at the corpse, he stopped. For the first time in his life, he hesitated. He looked at the face of the man who had caused so much misery, and he looked at the bread. He knew that if he ate it, he would be taking on the cruelty of a monster. And he realized that his own soul was already so full, so stretched to the breaking point, that one more heavy sin might shatter him completely. He turned to the family, his hands shaking, and said, I cannot." He walked out. The family was left screaming, terrified that their father was doomed. It was the moment the system broke. The moment the human garbage can overflowed. This brings us to the edge of the modern era. The Sin Eater didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. He faded away, pushed out by the twin forces of religious orthodoxy and scientific progress. But he didn't disappear completely without leaving a trace. The last confirmed Sin Eater, a man named Richard Munslow, died in 1906. Think about that date. 1906. Einstein had already published his theory of special relativity. The Wright brothers had flown. The world was modern. And yet, in a small village in Shropshire, a man was still carrying the sins of his neighbors in his stomach. Richard Munslow was different, though. He wasn't a beggar. He wasn't a destitute outcast. He was a farmer, a respectable man. So why did he take up this cursed mantle? Why did he revive a dying, hated tradition in the 20th century? His story is the final, heartbreaking chapter of this saga, and it reveals the true tragedy of the Sin Eater. It wasn't always about money. Sometimes it was about a grief so profound that damnation seemed like a fair price to pay. In Part 4, we will tell the story of Richard Munslow. We will stand at his grave in Ratlinghope. We will examine the tragic loss of his children that drove him to try and save his village from the ghosts that haunted him. The mercenary era of the Sin Eater was over. The era of the tragic hero had begun. The war with the church was ending, not with a bang, but with the quiet weeping of a father who just wanted to make sure his children were safe in the afterlife. The shadows are almost gone now. The electric light is coming. But in the twilight, one man is still eating the bread. Join me in the next part as we meet the last Sin Eater. The year is 1906. Let that date sink in for a moment. 1906. Queen Victoria is dead. The Edwardian era is in full swing. In America, the Wright brothers have already flown their airplane. In London, the underground is rushing commuters to modern offices, and electric lights are pushing back the night across the civilized world. Science, industry, and reason are conquering the globe. The shadows of the Middle Ages have supposedly been banished by the bright light of progress. But in a small, damp valley in Shropshire, England, a place called Ratlinghope, time has stopped. Here, the electric light has not yet reached. Here, the mist clings to the hills like a shroud, and the old ways, the dark ways, are still alive. In this valley, a man named Richard Munslow is dying, and with his death, a tradition that has spanned 1,000 years of human fear is about to take its final breath. Richard Munslow is the most important figure in our story because he breaks every rule we have established so far. Throughout this series, we have profiled the Sin Eater as a beggar, an outcast, a wretch living on the fringes of society, trading his soul for a sixpence because he was starving. But Richard Munslow was none of these things. He was a yeoman farmer. He owned land. He had a home. He was respectable. He had money in his pocket and food on his table. He did not need the bread. He did not need the coin. By all accounts, he should have been one of the people hiring a Sin Eater, not the one becoming one. So why did he do it? Why did a man of standing lower himself to become the filth eater of the valley? The answer lies not in poverty, but in a tragedy so profound that it shattered his world and reshaped his understanding of God. To understand Richard Munslow, we must look at the graveyard in Ratlinghope. There, you will find the graves of his children. In the mid-19th century, tragedy struck the Munslow household with the violence of a storm. Accounts vary on the specifics. Some say it was whooping cough, others say it was a sudden fever, but the result was the same. Within a terrifyingly short span, possibly just a week, 3 of his children died. Imagine the devastation. 1 child is a tragedy. 3 is a massacre of the heart. But for a man of that time and place, the grief was compounded by a terrifying anxiety. His children had died suddenly. They had died young. Had they lived long enough to sin? Had they been absolved? In the panic of their illness, had the last rites been performed correctly? Munslow looked at the church, and he found it wanting. The priest could offer prayers, he could offer hope, but he couldn't offer the one thing a grieving father desperately needed: certainty. The priest couldn't promise that his children weren't suffering in purgatory. And so, legend has it that Richard Munslow made a choice that defied the social order. If the church couldn't guarantee his children's peace, he would do it himself. He revived the old ritual. But he didn't do it as a mercenary. He did it as a father. He ate the sins of his own children to ensure they could enter heaven. He took their burdens into his own grieving heart. But he didn't stop there. Once he had crossed that line, once he had become the sin-eater for his own flesh and blood, he couldn't turn away from his neighbors. He looked around his valley, this isolated, close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, and he saw other families suffering the same terror. He saw widows weeping for husbands who had died drunk or angry. He saw mothers terrified for their sons. And because he knew that pain, because he lived with it every day, he stepped forward. This marked a fundamental shift in the history of the profession. For centuries, the sin-eater had been a figure of disgust. But Munslow changed the dynamic. He wasn't doing it for the sixpence. He often gave the money away, or refused it entirely. He was doing it out of a dark, heavy kind of love. He was a martyr, not a scavenger. The ritual under Munslow was different. It was quieter, more solemn. When he walked into a cottage where a body lay, the family didn't recoil in disgust. They bowed their heads in something approaching reverence. They still feared him. He was still absorbing evil, after all. But they respected the sacrifice. He was a man of their own class, a neighbor, who was willing to dirty his soul so they could sleep at night. He became a strange, tragic figure in the landscape. People would see him walking the hills of Rattling Hope, a solitary figure against the gray sky. They said he looked older than his years, bent under a weight that couldn't be seen. And in a way, he was. He wasn't just carrying the sins of the dead, he was carrying the grief of the living. He was the valley's designated mourner. But this noble sacrifice came with a terrible price. By reviving the practice, Munslow isolated himself. Even though he was a farmer and a landowner, he set himself apart. He couldn't go to the pub and drink with the other men in the same way. There was always a distance. How do you joke with a man who ate your father's sins last Tuesday? How do you discuss the harvest with a man who you believe is technically damned to hell? He lived in a kind of twilight zone, respected, but alone. The church authorities, of course, were horrified. Here was a respectable man, a man who should have known better, engaging in what they considered pagan necromancy. But they couldn't bully him like they bullied the beggars. He was independent. He was stubborn. And he was loved by the people in a way the vicar never was. As the years passed and the 19th century turned into the 20th, Munslow grew old. The practice was dying out everywhere else. The beggars were gone, moved to the workhouses or the cities. The folklore was fading, replaced by newspapers and modern skepticism. But in Rattling Hope, Munslow kept the tradition alive by the sheer force of his will. He was a living anachronism, a relic of a time when magic was real and terrifying. But even a sin-eater is mortal. In 1906, Richard Munslow lay on his own deathbed. This is the moment of ultimate irony, the question that hangs over the entire history of this profession. When the sin-eater dies, who eats his sins? For the beggar sin-eaters of the past, the answer was simple: no one. They died damned, thrown into a pauper's grave. But for Munslow, the situation was more poignant. The villagers loved him. They owed him. Many of them believed their eternal peace was bought with his sacrifice. They gathered around his home. They prayed. But there was no one to take the bread. There was no successor. The line ended with him. The younger generation didn't know the ritual, or they were too afraid, or perhaps too modern to perform it. Munslow died with the accumulated spiritual debt of an entire village inside him. He died carrying the sins of his children, his neighbors, and himself. They buried him in the Rattling Hope churchyard. It is a real grave. You can visit it today. It stands as a testament to the strange truce that eventually formed between him and the church. Despite his heretical life, the priest buried him. Perhaps even the church recognized that there was something holy in his willingness to be damned for others. His grave is not unmarked. In fact, years later, the community restored it. It is a sturdy stone, marking the resting place of the last sin-eater. But when they lowered him into the ground in 1906, they weren't just burying a man. They were burying a millennium of history. They were burying the medieval world. With Munslow's death, the psychological safety net was gone. The people of Rattling Hope had to face death differently now. They had to rely on the priest's maybe instead of the sin-eater's certainty. They had to learn to live with the anxiety that the dead might not be at peace. Or perhaps they just stopped believing in the ghosts. Maybe that is what really killed the sin-eater. Not the church, not the law, not the lack of men willing to do the job. Maybe it was the fact that the world simply stopped being afraid of the dark in the same way. The electric light didn't just illuminate the room, it illuminated the mind. It chased away the shadows where the ghosts lived. And without the ghosts, you don't need the sin-eater. But before we close the book on Richard Munslow, we must ask ourselves, did it work? Not the magic. We can debate theology and folklore all day, but the psychological function. Did he bring peace? The answer is undeniably yes. For the grieving mother in 1890, watching Munslow eat the bread meant she could sleep without nightmares. It meant she could stop looking for her dead child in the shadows of the nursery. It meant closure. In a world without grief counselors or therapists, Richard Munslow took the pain of his community and made it disappear. He was a placebo for the soul, and placebos can be incredibly powerful things. His story changes the way we look at this bizarre job. It forces us to see the humanity behind the horror. It forces us to realize that sometimes the scariest things people do are done out of love. But Munslow's death in 1906 leaves us with a lingering question. If the ritual is gone, where did the need for it go? The human need to absolve ourselves of guilt, to unburden our consciences, didn't disappear just because we invented the telephone. We still carry sins. We still fear that our mistakes will haunt us. We still look for ways to transfer our pain onto others. The sin-eater as a profession is dead, but the sin-eater as a concept? That is very much alive. We just call it by different names now. We have created new rituals, new scapegoats, new ways to try and wash ourselves clean. In the next part of this series, we are going to leave the muddy hills of Shropshire and step into the modern mind. We will explore the legacy of the Sin Eater. We will look at how this ancient idea echoes in our modern culture, from literature to psychology. We will see how we have replaced the bread and the corpse with confessionals, therapy couches, and social media apologies. Richard Munslow lies quiet in his grave. The sins he ate are buried with him. But the hunger for forgiveness? That is eternal. Join me in Part 5 as we dissect the ghosts of the modern world. Richard Munslow lies in his grave in Ratlinghope, and with him, the physical act of sin-eating has turned to dust. There are no more wooden bowls of ale. There are no more crusts of bread placed on cold chests in the moonlight. If you were to walk into a funeral home today and suggest such a ritual, you would be met with horror or laughter. We are civilized now. We are rational. We have moved past the need for such barbaric superstitions. Or have we? The specific ritual is dead, yes. But the psychological machinery that created the Sin Eater? That is as alive today as it was in 1680. In fact, one could argue that in our modern, hyper-connected world, the hunger for a Sin Eater is more ravenous than ever. We just don't call them by that name anymore. We have sanitized the terminology, hidden the magic under layers of bureaucracy and technology. But the fundamental transaction remains. We still desperately want to transfer our guilt, our trauma, and our filth onto someone else. To understand the modern Sin Eater, we first have to look at how the concept refused to die in our culture. Even after Munslow was buried, the idea of the Sin Eater continued to haunt the Western imagination. It survived in literature, in film, and in television. Why? Because there is something undeniably seductive about the concept. Think about it. The idea that you can live however you want, lie, cheat, steal, hurt people, and then, at the very end, simply hand that burden to someone else? That is the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. It is a terrifying concept, but also a deeply wishful one. We see this fascination in pop culture constantly. From the 2003 film The Order with Heath Ledger, to episodes of The X-Files and Night Gallery, writers keep returning to this figure. But in fiction, the Sin Eater is often portrayed as a magical being, a dark superhero bearing a tragic curse. Real life, however, offers us a different kind of Sin Eater, one stripped of magic but burdened with the same psychological weight. Let's look at the scapegoat mechanism. This is a concept explored by philosophers like René Girard. He argued that all societies are built on a foundation of communal violence and blame. When tension builds up in a community, too much anger, too much guilt, too much fear, the group needs a release valve. They need someone to blame. They need a vessel to pour all their toxicity into, so they can destroy that vessel and feel clean again. In the medieval village, the Sin Eater was a passive scapegoat. He took the sins voluntarily, or for money. Today, we create scapegoats aggressively. Look at our culture of public shaming. Look at cancel culture, regardless of your political stance on it. The mechanics are eerily similar to the ancient ritual. A person is identified as having sinned. The community gathers around. They pile their collective outrage, their judgment, and their moral superiority onto this one individual. They project all of society's failings onto this single target. And then, they cast them out. They destroy their career, their reputation, their social standing. And once that person is destroyed, the mob feels a sense of catharsis. They feel righteous. They feel clean. We are good, they say, because we expelled the bad one. It is a digital version of the Sin Eater ritual, but with a cruel twist. Instead of paying the Sin Eater to take the sins, we destroy the Sin Eater to prove we have no sins of our own. The target becomes the vessel for our collective shadow, absorbing the darkness of the tribe so the tribe can remain pure. But there are also people who perform the function of the Sin Eater in a more literal, professional sense. These are the people who absorb the trauma of the world so the rest of us can sleep at night. They are the invisible workforce of the macabre. Consider the crime scene cleaner. When a violent death occurs, a murder, a suicide, a decomposition undiscovered for weeks, the family cannot handle the physical reality of it. The police investigate, the coroner takes the body, but who cleans the blood? Who removes the remnants of a life ended in violence? The cleaner comes in. Like the Sin Eater, they enter a house of death when everyone else is fleeing. They scrub away the horror. They make the room look like nothing ever happened. They erase the stain of the bad death so the living can reclaim the space. They absorb the visual trauma so the family doesn't have to. Or consider a more modern digital example, the content moderator. Every day, millions of hours of video are uploaded to the internet. Most of it is harmless. But some of it is the darkest material imaginable. Child abuse, torture, terrorism, beheadings, extreme violence. If this content were allowed to flood our social media feeds, society would recoil in horror. The illusion of a civilized world would shatter. So, we hire people to stop it. These moderators sit in cubicles, often in developing countries, and they watch the worst of humanity for 8 hours a day. They watch the murders. They watch the abuse. They act as the filter. They absorb the digital poison into their own eyes and minds, hitting the delete button so that you and I never have to see it. We scroll through our clean, curated feeds, looking at cat videos and vacation photos, blissfully ignorant of the horror that was filtered out just milliseconds before it reached our screens. The content moderator is the Sin Eater of the digital age. They consume the filth of the world to keep our digital souls clean. And just like the medieval Sin Eater, they pay a terrible price. High rates of PTSD, depression, and suicide plague the industry. They are polluted by what they see, sacrificed on the altar of our comfort. And then there is the realm of psychology itself. In a secular world, we have replaced the priest with the therapist. Now, I am not saying therapy is a superstitious ritual. It is a vital medical practice. But look at the dynamic. You go to a private room. You sit with a person who is sworn to secrecy. And you pour out your darkest secrets, your shames, your sins. You tell them the things you would never tell your spouse or your mother. The therapist listens. They hold that space. They contain your anxiety. In psychoanalytic terms, this is sometimes called containment. The therapist takes in the patient's unbearable feelings, processes them, and hands them back in a manageable form. They are, in a very real, benevolent sense, eating your pain. They are helping you metabolize the parts of yourself you cannot digest alone. But unlike the Sin Eater, the therapist is trained to not let it destroy them. They have supervision. They have techniques to wash the bowl. The medieval Sin Eater had no such protection. He just swallowed the poison and hoped it wouldn't kill him. We also see the echo of the Sin Eater in our legal system. What is a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, if not a form of paid silence, a way to bury a sin? A wealthy person commits a wrong, harassment, negligence, abuse. They pay a sum of money to the victim. In exchange, the victim agrees never to speak of it. The money changes hands. The sin is legally erased. The bread is eaten. The wealthy person goes on with their reputation intact, while the victim often carries the silent burden of the truth, unable to speak it, effectively forced to swallow the injustice. The parallels are everywhere once you start looking. We are a species that is terrified of our own shadow. We are terrified of the consequences of our actions. We are terrified of the stain that guilt leaves on our conscience. And so, we are always looking for a mechanism to transfer that stain. The tragedy of the medieval sin-eater was that he was a single man bearing the weight of a village. The tragedy of the modern world is that we have industrialized the process. We have fragmented the sin-eater into 1,000 different professions, institutions, and social behaviors. We have built a machine to eat our sins, but the machine runs on human fuel. As we approach the end of our journey, we must confront the final, uncomfortable truth. We look back at the people of the 17th century and we judge them. We think them foolish for believing that a piece of bread could save a soul. We think them cruel for paying a beggar to damn himself. But are we any different? We export our trash to other countries so we don't have to see it. We outsource the slaughter of our food so we don't have to hear the screams. We pay moderators to watch violence so we can pretend the world is safe. We are still paying people to eat our sins. We just pay them in wages instead of sixpences, and we hide them in offices instead of the woods. The sin-eater didn't die in 1906. He just put on a suit. He just put on a uniform. He just signed a contract. He is everyone who does the dirty work that allows the rest of us to feel clean. In the final part of this series, we will bring it all home. We will look at the ultimate meaning of this dark history. We will ask what the story of the sin-eater teaches us about the human condition, about forgiveness, and about the one thing we can never truly outrun: ourselves. We have walked through the mud of the past and the concrete of the present. Now, only the verdict remains. Join me for the conclusion in Part 6, where we face the... We have reached the end of the road. We have traveled from the rain-soaked valleys of the 17th century, through the hidden woods where the outcasts lived, past the angry pulpits of the church, and stood by the lonely grave of Richard Munslow. We have seen how the sin-eater evolved from a desperate beggar into a tragic father, and finally, into the invisible gears of our modern society. Now, as the candle burns low, we are left with the silence. And in this silence, we must answer the question that has been haunting us since the very first loaf of bread was placed on a dead man's chest. What does it all mean? When we strip away the folklore, the superstition, and the strange rituals, what is the story of the sin-eater really about? It isn't about ghosts. It isn't about bread. It is about the unbearable weight of being human. Throughout history, humans have been terrified of many things: fire, flood, plague, starvation. But there is one fear that is unique to our species, a fear that no animal shares: the fear of our own conscience. We are the only creatures on Earth who can look back at our actions and feel the crushing weight of regret. We are the only creatures who worry about the stain on our souls. The sin-eater was not invented because people were stupid. He was invented because people were fragile. Imagine living in a world where you believed, with absolute certainty, that a single mistake, a single moment of anger, or a secret lust could lead to eternal torture. That pressure is enough to crack the mind. The sin-eater was a safety valve for the human psyche. He was a mechanism of mercy. He allowed people to believe that mistakes could be fixed, that the slate could be wiped clean, that there was a way out of the trap of their own imperfections. In this light, the sin-eater was the ultimate altruist. Yes, he was paid a sixpence. Yes, he was often a beggar. But look at what he actually did. He stood between his community and the darkness. He said, "Give me your fear. Give me your nightmares. Give me the things you cannot live with. I will carry them for you." He was a human shield against the wrath of God. But there is a darker truth we must confront in this final chapter. The lie. The fundamental lie at the heart of the ritual. Can you really transfer a sin? Can you really pay someone to take away your guilt? Deep down, even the villagers might have known the answer was no. You cannot buy a clean conscience. You cannot outsource your morality. The sin-eater provided comfort, yes, but it was a narcotic comfort. It allowed people to avoid doing the hard work of living good lives because they believed they could just pay for a cleanup at the end. It was a spiritual bypass. And this is where the mirror turns to face us. We look back at the medieval peasants with pity, but we are engaged in the same desperate flight from accountability. We live in a culture that is obsessed with moving on, with closure, with finding the quick fix for our trauma and our guilt. We want the pill, the therapy session, the public apology, the PR strategy that makes the bad thing go away. We want a sin-eater. We want someone to come in, eat the mess we made, and tell us that we are good people again. But the lesson of history is that the bread never really disappears. The sin-eater might swallow it, but the memory remains. The consequences remain. The damage we do to each other cannot be magically erased by a ritual, ancient or modern. So, where does that leave us? If we cannot hire a sin-eater, what do we do with our sins? Perhaps the death of the sin-eater profession forces us to grow up. It forces us to accept that there is no magical solution to guilt. We have to carry it ourselves. We have to sit with our mistakes. We have to look at the pain we have caused and own it, without trying to push it onto a scapegoat, without trying to pay someone to take it away. This is the hard path of the modern soul. We are our own priests now. We are our own sin-eaters. When we do wrong, we have to digest that bitterness ourselves. We have to process it, learn from it, and try to heal the damage we caused. There is no one coming out of the woods to save us. But there is beauty in this too. If we are the ones carrying the weight, then we are also the ones capable of true forgiveness. Not the bought forgiveness of a sixpence, but the earned forgiveness of change. Let's think back to Richard Munslow, the last sin-eater. Why does his story resonate so deeply? Because he did it for love. He didn't do it to escape. He did it to protect. And in that act, he showed us the redeemed version of the sin-eater. Maybe the true legacy of the sin-eater isn't the superstition, but the empathy. The willingness to help someone else carry a burden that is too heavy for them. We don't need to eat bread off corpses to do this. We do it when we listen to a friend's grief without judging them. We do it when we forgive someone who has hurt us, absorbing their wrong and choosing not to return it with violence. We do it when we help a stranger, not for a reward, but because we know how hard it is to be human. In that sense, the sin-eater never really died. The ritual died, but the spirit of the act, the bearing of one another's burdens, is the foundation of all love and all community. As we close the book on this strange, dark, and heartbreaking chapter of history, I want you to remember the image of the sin-eater one last time. Not as a monster in the shadows, not as a fool, but as a lonely figure walking into the dark so that others could stay in the light. He was the garbage collector of the soul. He was the scapegoat. He was the dam against the flood. And in a cruel, terrifying world, he was sometimes the only hope a family had. History has judged him harshly. The church condemned him. The modern world mocked him. But tonight, let us offer him a different verdict. Let us offer him the one thing he gave to thousands of others, but never received for himself. Let us offer him understanding. The next time you sit down to a meal and you break a piece of bread, take a second to look at it. Think of the centuries of fear and hope that were once baked into that simple food. Think of the men who ate it with trembling hands in rooms that smelled of death. We are free of the ritual now. The ghosts are gone. The woods are empty. But the question remains, whispering in the back of our minds. When the night comes and the silence falls, and you are left alone with your own conscience, who eats your sins? Thank you for taking this long journey into the dark with me. It has been a heavy story, one of the strangest and most profound I have ever researched. If this series has made you look at history, and perhaps yourself, a little differently, then the Sin Eater has done his job one last time. If you made it all the way to the end of this 6-part saga, you are the true keepers of history. Please, leave a comment below. I want to know, do you think the Sin Eater was a hero or a victim? Or was he something else entirely? Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves the dark corners of the past. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. There are many more stories hidden in the shadows, waiting to be brought into the light. Until next time, sleep well and be kind to your own ghosts.